The Cabinet Room in Jerusalem, June 1976. A high-level government meeting is interrupted when an assistant walks in carrying a handwritten note. It is passed silently to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The room goes entirely quiet. Rabin reads the note aloud. Air France Flight 139, a wide-bodied Airbus A300, has been hijacked by 4 people carrying weapons in their luggage. The terrorists have just separated the Israeli and Jewish passengers from the rest of the group. Several men in that room were survivors of the Holocaust. They did not need an explanation for what they had just heard. Just 30 years after the camps were liberated, a German voice was once again reading Jewish names off a list in an airport terminal. It was a moment that demanded a military response. This map shows the geographic scale of the problem. The hostages were 2,500 miles away in the heart of Africa. A rescue force must thread past Egyptian radar and Soviet naval vessels, crossing countries where they had no right to fly. The hostages were not just held by terrorists, they were under the active protection of Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. His army surrounded the terminal, working with the hijackers to ensure the perimeter remained sealed against any outside intervention. History remembers the ensuing 53-minute raid as a pristine military miracle. In reality, the operation was a deeply flawed endeavor, held together by desperate gambles and paid for with tragic costs. Physical preparations began in the desert. Using original blueprints from the firm that built the Entebbe terminal, Israeli construction crews erected a full-scale replica. Soldiers ran these assault routes until every corridor and doorway lived in their muscles, allowing them to navigate the building at full speed in the dark. Bypassing the airport guards required a bizarre deception. Idi Amin frequently traveled in a specific motorcade, so the military tracked down a Mercedes of the same model and spray-painted it the precise shade of the president's car. They even prepared matching Land Rovers to complete the presidential security detail. Moving in the dark while wearing Ugandan uniforms created a high risk of friendly fire. To identify each other, every commando wore a small white cotton hat. It was a modest detail intended to distinguish a friend from an enemy in the low light of a terminal floor. The military launched the rescue planes before the cabinet in Jerusalem had even formally voted yes. As the 4 C-130 transport aircraft lifted off, the people with the authority to send them were still arguing in a conference room. 100 elite soldiers flew 2,000 miles over the Red Sea in complete radio silence. By the time the government officially authorized the mission, the planes were already deep in African airspace, carrying men who had already handed their farewell letters to colleagues. This was a massive physical commitment made by soldiers who accepted the possibility of never returning, long before the politicians had reached a consensus. The first transport plane rolled silently onto the runway at Entebbe with its exterior lights cut. The rear ramp dropped, and the black Mercedes rolled out first, leading the motorcade toward the terminal. The plan fractured immediately. A Ugandan guard at the checkpoint raised his rifle, noticing a detail the Israelis missed. Idi Amin had recently switched to a white Mercedes. The commander of the assault, Yonatan Netanyahu, fired his silenced pistol to neutralize the threat. A second Israeli soldier fired simultaneously, but his weapon was not silenced. The crack of that shot tore through the night, alerting the guards and the hijackers inside. The 53-minute clock began. The commandos sprinted 200 meters across the open tarmac toward the terminal. In the rush and the darkness, the assault team's deputy ran right past the designated entrance, taking his squad through the wrong door and throwing the configuration of the breach into chaos. Inside the hall, commandos shouted for everyone to stay down. A 25-year-old French hostage named Jean-Jacques Maimoni did not speak Hebrew and stood up as the soldiers entered. A commando saw a figure rising fast and fired. Maimoni was killed by the soldiers who had come to rescue him. Outside, Ugandan soldiers opened fire from the roof. Yonatan Netanyahu, leading from the front of the assault, was shot between the shoulder blades. He fell on the same tarmac he had just crossed, dying while his men were still clearing the building. As the initial plan shattered, on contact with the Ugandan guards, the soldiers' training took over. They moved forward on muscle memory, navigating the terminal by instinct, even as the logic of the operation collapsed around them. While the hostages were secured, a second team moved toward the military airstrip. One airborne Ugandan fighter jet could easily intercept a slow transport plane on the flight home. so the Israeli forces had to neutralize the entire airfield. Explosive charges were placed on 11 MiG fighters. Sequential detonations sent 11 fireballs into the sky, visible from the terminal where the evacuation was already underway. Soldiers formed a human chain to move 102 hostages, the wounded, and Yonatan Netanyahu's body onto the waiting C-130s. They worked under the cover of the burning MiGs, counting every person again and again to ensure no one was left behind. The first plane began its roll just 31 minutes after landing. By minute 53, the last aircraft lifted off from the tarmac, leaving the bullet-riddled terminal behind. In less time than most people spend deciding what to have for dinner, an elite force had executed an intercontinental raid, neutralized an entire air force, and departed with the survivors. The planes landed in Tel Aviv on July 4th. While Americans were lighting fireworks for their bicentennial, celebrating 200 years of independence, the commandos were quietly retrieving their farewell letters from their colleagues and returning to their lives without a parade. The celebration of the rescue was immediate, but inside the planes, the mood was heavy. The final count on the tarmac was 102. One person was still missing. Her name was Dora Bloch. She was 74 years old. 2 days before the raid, the hijackers had allowed her to be taken to a hospital in Kampala because a piece of meat had lodged in her throat. She was 60 kilometers away from the airport when the planes arrived. After the raid, Idi Amin ordered his officers to the hospital. Dora Bloch was dragged from her bed and murdered in retaliation for the humiliation of the Israeli rescue. The old terminal at Entebbe still stands. The bullet holes from that night have been in those concrete walls for nearly 50 years, left as a permanent physical record of what happened on that floor. Operational brilliance is the agonizingly human refusal to stop moving forward when the plan fails and everything goes wrong. It is found in the 53 minutes where a fractured strategy was reassembled in the dark, under fire, by people who simply refuse to leave each other behind.